And thank all of you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very, very excited to stand up before you and address you. And for those of you who know me, I get excited when I get to talk to you, and it's a great year. And putting this presentation together, our team has had a lot of fun with this. Over the winter months, we cracked open the old vaults under the mountain, and we pulled out 90 years of association archives. And it was a lot of fun describing what Super 8 is. And I believe with Katie, we had to go around the block on what a 35 millimeter carousel looks like. And it was humorous, but it was also humbling because my handwriting was on a lot of those boxes. And that was the newest boxes in the archive, which were put in there a little less than 20 years ago when the association decamped from 919th Street in Washington, D.C., and some of you will remember that location. And I was a manager of environment, health, and safety at that time, low enough on the totem pole that I got to pack a lot of boxes. And there's a lot of really interesting memories in those boxes. I want to talk just briefly, remind us about some of our history. But before we can talk about what the association was and what the industry was, it's important to recognize where we are today and what this industry is. Our association is a thoroughly modern, best-in-class, hitting on all cylinders trade association, not just absolutely your team in Washington, but more importantly, you the people that are in these committees and doing the work throughout this association. And when we do it right, we are as or more effective than any industry group in Washington, D.C. today. And our medal, we go out and visit you, and you guys, you smelt metal from alumina, you remelt it from scrap, you form it, transform it, move it all over the country in incredible quantities, tons of it moving here, there, and yonder, and the innovation is amazing, and quite frankly, from our point of view, it's exhausting to look at. But our medal comes by its moniker of the magic medal, very, very honestly, and I just very humbly, before we move on, I want to remind you of that. We make people fly. This medal put men on the moon. We put satellites in the sky that make your phones work. If you pull out your phone, it's probably made of aluminum. We're everywhere in the built environment. Our metal lets more light in our homes. It lets us move the electricity that lights our homes at night. We cook in it. We eat out of it. We certainly drink from it. And when you go to your refrigerator and open it, your refrigerator is probably partly made of aluminum itself. We are ubiquitous today. And it's worth noting, just briefly, the 90 years of our history and the only 130, 140 years of history of the metal itself that has brought us here today. Looking back, the Aluminum Association met in 1938 at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the modern aluminum industry. We are a baby compared to most other commodity materials. The association was founded by an act of Congress under the National Industrial Recovery Act during the New Deal. Our first meeting actually took place 5 years before this photo was taken, and we met in Pittsburgh in 1933. That resulted in the creation of the Association of Manufacturers of the Aluminum Industry. Our forefathers loved their OVs, and as you'll hear in a moment. The New Deal legislation that created the association was actually struck down by the Supreme Court just a couple of years after 1933. And in 1935, between then and this picture, our industry's earliest leaders reorganized independently as the Aluminum Association. Our initial charter was, and I quote, "Promote the general welfare of the aluminum industry, of members of it, and all others affected by it, and to increase the usefulness of the industry to the general public." Despite being somewhat clunky, I think we can draw a straight line from that mission to what we do today. In the 1940s, the industry moved seamlessly with the country out of the Great Depression and into World War II. As part of FDR's arsenal of democracy, aluminum production expanded during this time by more than 10x. in the final years of the 1930s and before entry into the war. Meanwhile, the energy infrastructure changes enabled by the New Deal programs like the Tennessee Valley Authority and others drove the expansion of significant U.S. smelting capacity. Many of those smelters were known and loved. I know I worked for many of them. I see a few people out here who did. Aluminum was vital to the war effort, especially in munitions, shipbuilding, and aviation. In fact, a single B-29 Superfortress bomber used 50,000 pounds of aluminum, which was 2/3 of its overall weight. During the course of the war, the industry designed and built more than 50 new aluminum fabrication plants around the United States in coordination with the U.S. government. And the association served as the focal point. We liaised with the government, developed early industry statistics, and even organized a recruiting campaign to bring more women workers into aluminum plants with so many men overseas. Moving into the 1950s, the post-war economic boom brought the aluminum industry more and more into the everyday life of Americans. The industry found ways to pivot production capacity built up during the war to meet the demands of a growing consumer economy. And given our present location, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the association's first Greenbrier meeting was at this time. It took place in 1948 and throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. Around the country, aluminum was everywhere. Aluminum was in packaging, especially foil, commercial aviation, home appliances, and especially the built environment. We were even a major part of mid-century modern design when aluminum became closely linked to the modern design movement, which, as you see on the screen there. All of this called for standardization and a system to better facilitate the flow of metal across this proliferation of uses, and the association met this need. The first meeting of the technical committee was on May of 1954, that is today's Technical Committee on Product Standards. From here, the industry developed the alloy designation system that we use today, and in fact, the original pamphlet laying out the standard system is in the permanent collection of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. In 1954, the list was 75 unique chemical compositions long for various aluminum alloys. Today, it stands at more than 530. Moving into the 1960s, yes, this was the Madman era, as it's clear from the advertisement that you see on the screen. We saw continuous economic expansion throughout the 1960s and an increasingly professionalized aluminum association. This included the appointment of the association's first professional executive director, S.L. Goldsmith. We also saw the introduction of our ongoing statistical tracking and reporting program, which is still alive and well today, and the release of the first Aluminum Statistics Review in 1962. And it was only in 1979 that the first Aluminum Situation Report was released, for those of you who are avid readers. In the 1970s, we saw the birth of the modern recycling movement. Aluminum was always a recycling industry. The industry had for long found ways to bring back as much material as possible. We did recycling before it was cool and certainly before it was green. But in the 70s, with the aluminum beverage can well established in the marketplace, more aluminum was directly in the hands of consumers than ever before. From that starting point, the industry essentially built modern-day consumer recycling as it exists today, beginning with mobile collection units, can drives, state recycling refund programs, and many more programs. Mass promotion by the Aluminum Association raised the consciousness of consumers about the need to bring this material back into the system. It was also at the 1970s, as an aside, that the Aluminum Association decamped from New York and moved to Washington, D.C., where it resides today. As we turned into the 1980s from the 70s, the U.S. aluminum industry rode a wave of economic expansion for all three of our major markets. Perhaps most visibly during this optimistic decade, aluminum was a crucial component of the shuttle program, as evidenced by that's Discovery at Udvar-Hazy in Washington, D.C. We were critical to the history of aviation. We were there at the beginning, and we're there now. The Wright brothers used aluminum in the first plane that flew. The material was used extensively for other space programs and is still used that way today. Our low weight, high strength, and thermal properties all make it the ideal material. In the 1990s, back here on Earth, we saw aluminum's growth in the automotive market. It really took off at this time, with pounds per vehicle more than doubling across the decade. As automotive makers look to meet consumer and government demands for safe, high-performance, and fuel-efficient vehicles, the association created the Auto Aluminum Alliance to bring automakers and the industry together and to solve pre-competitive challenges in getting more aluminum into the vehicle. We formed the Auto Light Truck Group, which became today's Aluminum Transportation Group, and it was even housed in Detroit for quite a time with an association office. We also at that time took on one of our first competitive trade challenges with the fall of the USSR and the flood of aluminum onto the global market. The Aluminum Association worked with the US government on an international memorandum of understanding which managed that capacity and that inventory. Moving into the 2000s, at the turn of the new century, issues around emissions, sustainability, and the climate grew in importance. The Aluminum Association took a relatively forward-leaning stance on many of these issues, working on voluntary programs with the EPA and endorsing cap-and-trade policy. We pursued the Voluntary Aluminum Industry Partnership, which reduced PFC emissions, not just in the United States, because we farmed this out to the world. We reduced PFC emissions from primary smelting by 80% between 1990 and 2015. Still a benchmark in industry voluntary action that is referenced by the Environmental Protection Agency. We founded 15 years ago, in 2008, the association's full-time sustainability initiative within the association to engage on policy, develop data, and widely communicate industry progress on carbon, recycling, and other issues. With persistent unfair trade practices in China throughout the decade, the 2010s were defined in many ways by a renewed focus on global trade. Perhaps not our first choice of activity as an association, but the industry rose to the challenge, came together in a united position, advocating and advancing a commitment to fair trade in the marketplace and a strong trade enforcement where rules were being broken. We won some and we lost some, and we came to a draw in some places. Perhaps no better typified by what you see on the screen. I was just out of frame in that picture when President Trump signed the Section 232 tariffs on aluminum imports. It is no small thing that this industry has taken action on trade and remain unified on trade. Trade policy tears industries apart, and I can say of all the many areas of consensus building and understanding within our industry, our ability to stand strong in this issue is unparalleled. So what's next? I'm glad to have been able to walk through, decade by decade, a couple of accomplishments of the industry, of your companies, and our association. I'm really looking forward to where we go in the future because, look, we're it. What we decide to do together will define our industry in the coming decades.